Hello and welcome to a briefing on highlights of Chapter 10, which is our reading from Module 8. In Module 8, we're exposed to issues associated with outsourcing in a global arena, ethics associated with ERP implementation, specifically as it relates to outsourcing implementation or portions of your system, and also security management. Let's face it, when you have a global organization, you've got ERP systems and components around the world with some components outsourced, there's plenty of room for discussion and how you're going to keep that network secure and how you're going to maintain things like privacy, for example, and compliance with financial reporting standards. All of those raise issues about managing the global environment, ethical issues, security issues. So let's look at some of the highlights in Chapter 10. Now, outsourcing, the idea behind outsourcing in general, there's two reasons to do it. Number one, you want to access expertise you don't have, or number two, you need to reduce your cost. But remember, in management, you never get something for nothing. If you want to improve your position in some way, you're going to have to apply management expertise. Not all companies understand this fully, and they attempt to outsource, and when they do, they end up spending more money than they originally planned rather than saving money. Or they run into some security disaster or implementation disaster. So it is potential. Outsourcing does have potential to offer great gains, but only if it's managed properly. So you have to understand what you're getting into. You have to make sure it's appropriate for your organization. There's oversight is something you consider, and also think about how you're going to manage security. Typically, a company would enter into an outsource agreement with another firm, usually to provide services or implement some components of your system, for example. It started originally in back office functions, such as tech support, software development. You also have to think about the quality you're going to have if you're going to outsource things like technical support. I remember running into trouble with Lenovo laptop and struggling to get technical support. Called the number that went to New York, but it is actually going to India, and I remember ping-ponging back and forth, not getting very good help. So consider that outsourcing, especially back office functions, only works if you can maintain the quality. This is a graphical overview of Figure 10.1 of outsourcing relationships. There's customer and the company, where you have products and services, interactions, service delivery. The customer may think they're working with a particular company, but actually they're working with an outsourced partner for some of their services. And there's a business relationship between the company and the outsourcer. So you can obtain a lot of different benefits: economic benefits, additional skills, technical expertise. And also an ERP system, never forget that multiple feedback points. Whoever you are working with as an outsourcing partner is going to be working with others. And because of that fact, your partner is going to know a lot about what's going on in the marketplace. So this is a good thing, a good benefit. You need to understand what some of the best practices are in outsourcing. Anyway, there's a long laundry list of things to think about, things to not think about, but just remember that outsourcing is not for the timid. You have to be smart about it. You do not, or let's say, you know that saying, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. That applies to outsourcing as much as anything. Consider that if you don't have expertise, your expectations aren't set right, there's going to be different cultures involved, hidden costs. I actually personally worked for a company that tried to develop a product with multiple outsource partners, and the intent was to save money and tap into expertise. But they spent over $100 million and didn't deliver anything. So it's really possible to have a disaster in outsourcing if you don't get this right. You need to understand your expertise, what it really is, what it isn't, understand what you don't know, and be prepared for a lot of hidden cost. Okay. Also remember that if you outsource a capability, you may lose that capability yourself, and you may not have full control over aspects of your ERP system. A lot of times you will outsource to an overseas partner. And when this happens, you're going to have language barriers. also cultural differences, also process differences. And it's going to be difficult for you to evaluate progress or metrics, things like this, if they're measured in a different way. So it's not easy at all to stay on top of an ongoing relationship with an offshore partner. Here's an example of customer-facing processes and functions that could be outsourced. Call center, web chats, telemarketing. I think we all have experienced this personally if we've ever had trouble with our cable system. All right, so when you're selecting an ERP vendor, consider if they've done outsourced work before, and also if they are an offshore partner, ask yourself what would happen if this doesn't work out. What are you going to do if the experiment is a disaster? Okay. Now, the next topic is software as a service. Instead of buying software, loading it on your own systems, you could rent or lease it from a vendor and access it by a browser. It's a model that's growing in popularity, potentially lower cost, definitely lower risk in implementation cycle. You can get better knowledge transfer from integrators to users of systems because you're going to be working with a supplier that does this all the time. Universal access, standardized applications, a lot of nice benefits of this, which is why the market has been generally trending in this way. But think about privacy, limited flexibility. You may need a lot of investment to configure and support the solution. Of course, you may need that investment anyway. And over a 3 to 5 year period, traditional ERP infrastructure might be cheaper than a software as a service solution. The reason is you're going to continue to pay fees for software as a service on an ongoing basis, whereas you may buy the main expense for the ERP system you spend up front and amortize that over time. So it's really kind of like a lease versus buy financial calculation that you need to consider. Think about best practices. You may have a representative to work on site to supervise the work. A formal governance process. I mean, one of the companies I worked with that had that $100 million disaster had no such formal governance process, that's for sure. Think about how you're going to install upgrades and plan for it. Who's accountable for what? Simple things like acceptance criteria. If an outsourced partner delivers something, how do they know what you're going to do to evaluate if it's ready? Because you want to avoid arguments about is something truly acceptable or not. Are you finished or not? Okay. Now ethics. Ethics get involved in global ERP implementations because you have access to other people's information, for one thing. Just because you have access to something, does that mean you should look at it? I mean, these are questions of morality. Ethical behavior is that which is good or right in a certain value system. And that's key, certain value system, because value systems, especially in global ERP implementations, are different. They differ around the world. For example, there's always been trouble with piracy of software. In Asia, for example, I was in Hong Kong several years ago, walking down the street, and I noticed a number of different shops. You could walk in, buy any software you want for $1 a CD. It was all pirated, because in the culture in Asia, especially in China at the time, there's a feeling that hardware was worth something, but software should be free. There was that ongoing feeling. It was more cultural than anything. So there are differences in how different cultures view ethics. So what are some of the main points to consider about ethics in a global ERP network? Privacy, making sure that people's information is safe, and people who shouldn't be seeing other people's information can't. Property rights, who owns certain intellectual property. I just mentioned software piracy. Access, who has access, who doesn't. And accuracy, especially accuracy of financial reporting. So these are some of the key elements to consider, and I'll let you read that in detail. But in general, privacy, you shouldn't allow others to snoop into files that they shouldn't see. For accuracy, you need to inform especially investors on what you're doing and why, and what your true financial position is. Property. Who owns the information collected on individuals? Who owns that? For example, if I go down to a grocery store and buy something and I use a frequent buyer card, I'm effectively handing over my rights to that information, and I'm being compensated for it by being presented with discounts. So information ownership is an issue. Accessibility. The only people who should be accessing things are those who have the right and the need to know particular information. There's different elements of a code of ethics for ERP. There's stockholder theory, and that is making sure your interest of investors are protected. You're reporting the right financial information. Stakeholders, you're protecting everyone who has an interest in the system and the outcome of the company. And social contract, the well-being of others before the interest of stakeholders or company owners. But remember, some key points here. Different systems of culture around the world have different views of ethics. Also, general accepted accounting principles have views on, well, not just views, but rules about what you can and can't do in financial reporting, and it's incumbent upon managers to make sure accuracy is in place. And Sarbanes-Oxley makes it so that if you do publish inaccurate financial information, the executives of the company could be personally liable. So it's very critical that you audit, and everyone in the company who's responsible for different segments of the system have to sign off, because the CEO is in effect personally signing off on the the veracity of the system. There's lots of different types of security to consider, from physical hardware to network to intrusion detection. And the bottom line for this module is that in a global system, it is a large-scale issue to consider. And if you don't believe me, you can look through the text and look at all the different memorable leaks. But there's far more than this. This is like 6 or 7 years old. You could just go to last year's Target and Home Depot data leaks. And now, finally, I want to mention portable devices. Computing is going portable. My son, for example, works for a major financial firm and IT support, and they're switching over to the Surface 3 instead of desktops because it has the power of the desktop, plus they can carry it everywhere. And it does introduce security issues. So consider outsourcing is a more important factor than it's ever been. There are a lot of issues. It requires management sophistication that many companies lack. If you're going to do that, you have to think of the cultural and geographical implications of outsourcing, especially when you're offshoring. There are a lot of technical details associated with security, but there's also ethical issues to be concerned with as well. So these are very large-scale issues for a manager to consider, and maybe makes you wonder whether ERP is a good decision. Well, if implementing an ERP system is very tough, you may want to consider software as a service. But remember, it is a purchase versus lease decision, because you have to think how long you're going to keep the system, because over the long run, buying your own system, as difficult as it may be cheaper in the long run. So these are some highlights from Chapter 10 and Module 8, so I'll see you in the discussion threads. And we're getting close to the end of the class. Only a couple more weeks to go, one more week to go, and look forward. It's been nice working with you, and we'll have a final briefing in week 9.